This all began about a week ago now with an announcement on social media that Donald Trump had a phone call with Vladimir Putin.
Mark MacKinnon is the senior international correspondent for The Globe.
And that was surprising to everybody because there was no forewarning, and it ended 3 years of American efforts to isolate Russia.
Former U.S. President Joe Biden hadn't spoken to Russian President Vladimir Putin since before Russia invaded Ukraine. A few days after that call between Trump and Putin, delegations from the U.S. and Russia met to discuss ending the war in Ukraine, without any representatives from Ukraine.
It's been really interesting. If I message a Ukrainian contact, and some of these are, senior military people, and ask them what they make of what's happening right now, all I get back are, shrug emojis or ... indicating speechlessness. And then Russian friends have been sending me this series of gifts. Sort of one of them had an American tanks taking part in a military parade with Russian and Belarusian military vehicles on, Victory Day. And another one, if I recall correctly, was a fake announcement of America imposing its first sanctions on Ukraine and giving its first military assistance to Russia. So, people are obviously astounded on both sides about what's taking place.
This Monday will mark 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. So today, Mark is on the show to talk about this turn in diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia, what it signals for the future of NATO, and where this leaves Ukraine. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Mark, thanks so much for being here again.
Thank you, Menaka.
So, Mark, a lot has happened over the past few days. We're speaking around 11:30 Eastern on Thursday. And earlier this week, U.S. and Russian delegations met in Saudi Arabia to talk about ending the war in Ukraine. What do we know, Mark, about what happened at those talks?
Well, the most significant part is that the talks took place. It's been 3 years of war. On Monday, it'll be the third anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And for 3 years, the United States, led by Joe Biden, has been sort of leading the West in an effort to isolate Russia, to punish it with sanctions, to support the Ukrainian military, to force Russia to bring an end to this illegal invasion. And all of a sudden, first there's a phone call between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, and then days later, we've got the U.S. Secretary of State meeting face-to-face, breaking this isolation with the Russian foreign minister and referring to him as a partner. And in terms of what Russia wants from any conversation, getting out of isolation, they just got it for free. Of course, there's still sanctions, and they'd like to see Western aid to Ukraine end, and they have all sorts of other things they'd like to give. But they got a massive gift for essentially nothing. And that's why the Kremlin right now is just enjoying what Mr. Trump is doing and seeing how far it'll go.
Yeah, so as you say, it's kind of astounding that this actually happened in the first place here. They made some statements at the end of these meetings as well. Do we know, I guess, details about what they talked about?
I mean, the most significant thing I've seen is, and it is really just sort of a series of tweets where Fox News reporters said they had been told there was and Fox obviously being close to the Trump administration, said they'd been told there was a 3-stage peace plan being booted about. And the first stage of this would be an immediate ceasefire along current front lines, which, would leave Russia in control of roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. And the second stage would be Ukrainian elections, followed by a third stage, which would be an actual peace negotiation. And actually, it's the second stage that probably is what will doom these talks to going not much further.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because the second stage was Ukrainian elections, you said. Why would that be such a sticking point?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very rare that outside countries, Moscow and Washington are saying Kyiv must have elections. But the reason why they're saying Kyiv needs to have elections is because Volodymyr Zelensky, who was elected with a huge mandate in 2019, his term in office theoretically expired last year in 2024. Of course, Ukraine's been under martial law since the start of the Russian invasion. And under martial law, you don't have elections. You don't have political competition. You're supposed to be, the country's supposed to be united. And so what they're effectively calling for is for Ukraine to end its martial law, which would, of course, be very damaging to its efforts to mobilize and conscript more people. Many people who are serving the front line might think, well, that's the end of this, and leave. And then secondly, have a potentially very damaging political infighting between parties that support the peace treaty, parties that don't support a peace treaty, parties that are pro-Moscow. And you can see, historically, Ukrainian elections have been plagued by, the West talks about Russian meddling in elections. In Ukraine, they mean like sort of running pro-Russian candidates backed by the Kremlin, like very, very open meddling. So it'd be a very, very troubling thing for Ukraine to do. At some point, they'll have to have an election, and the terms of a peace agreement will be obviously part of that discussion. But that would come after the peace agreement or after the end of the war anyways. And that's the way the Ukrainian constitution works, is that there's supposed to be a peace, then the martial law ends, and then 60 to 90 days later, you have an election. And they're saying basically the martial law, which was created by the Russian invasion, has to end before the Russian invasion stops.
Yeah. Something else I want to ask you about these talks, Mark, is about Saudi Arabia, because this is where these discussions were happening. How did they get involved in all of this? Why were the talks being held in Saudi Arabia?
That's yet another surprise in a week of surprises. There was an expectation that at some point Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump would have a meeting. I mean, Mr. Trump has talked about his close relationship with Mr. Putin in the past. I was there in 2018 when he met with Mr. Putin in Helsinki in Finland. But the speculation had been that there would be a summit at some point, and it would happen either in Geneva, Switzerland being sort of a traditional place for hosting peace summits, or Serbia had put its hand up with a leader, Alexander Vučić, who's sort of friendly with both the Trump administration and the Kremlin. For it to arrive in Saudi Arabia, a country where, there's not going to be any media that shows up unless they've been given permission. There's not going to be any demonstrations outside. It's a controlled atmosphere. And also, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has, again, close personal relations with both Trump and with Putin. And this is the style of negotiations that Trump and Putin both like, just the strong men in the room, no distractions, and nothing like, the Ukrainians present as they decide the fate of a country that isn't theirs.
Mark, you mentioned that previous meeting between Trump and Putin in 2018 in Helsinki. What was that meeting like?
That was a really remarkable event to be present at. I was part of the press pool for this meeting, and there were two things that were really remarkable. And the first one was Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin ended up in a room, just the two of them and Mr. Putin's translators, just three people in the room. And you could see just the American officials bewildered and really uncomfortable with the idea their president basically kicked out all of his national security team, his Secretary of State. And so he was meeting alone with the Russian president, this former KGB agent. There were questions in the air about Mr. Putin's hold on Mr. Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And then they came out, and most of us had planned to ask questions about, what have the two of them discussed about Syria, where Russian troops were intervening on behalf of Bashar al-Assad's regime. What had they discussed about Ukraine, where Russia was already occupying Crimea and fueling a separatist war in the Donbass region. And instead, the first question, I believe, came at Mr. Trump and said, Mr. Trump, did you ask Mr. Putin about the allegations that he meddled in the 2016 election? He said, well, Mr. Putin said he didn't do it. And, I take his version. And so the whole press conference got delayed into reporters going, really? And Trump saying, really? And, because it was just this incredible, the U.S. president taking the words of an ex-KGB agent, this longtime American adversary, over his own intelligence services, and again, having kicked out his own officials. So, that dynamic, this personal one-on-one dynamic between Trump and Putin goes back years, and again, will obviously be very important going forwards.
Yeah. Let's turn back to Ukraine, Mark. These most recent talks between the U.S. and Russia, they happened without any representatives from Ukraine, and without anyone from Europe either. The European Union, of course, has been quite involved in supporting Ukraine, and we are going to come back to Europe later. But have there been any talks between the U.S. and Ukraine the way that there have been between the U.S. and Russia?
No, and that's been a source of serious concern. So on Thursday, there was a meeting between President Zelensky and Mr. Trump's peace envoy, Keith Kellogg. Kellogg was in Kyiv and met with Volodymyr Zelensky, but they canceled the press conference that was supposed to happen afterwards, apparently at the U.S. insistence. But the Ukrainians have been forced to go public with their discontent here. So first, there was this phone call between Putin and Trump, which Zelensky appears to have only learned about when Trump posted about it on social media. Then there's this meeting in Saudi Arabia, which the Ukrainians were not present at. And so Mr. Zelensky, who was on his way to Saudi Arabia at a stop in Turkey, says, you can't have negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine present. Seems like a normal complaint to have. But Mr. Trump took this very personally and said later on, he said, well, they're complaining they're not there. They had 3 years to sort this out. I can, his classic routine about there never would have been a war if I'd been the president, et cetera. They should have made a deal.
He even actually said Ukraine shouldn't have started the war as well.
Yeah,
in that
shouldn't have
statement.
Exactly. And infers that Ukraine started the war. And then he said, and oh, by the way, Zelensky's got 4% popularity anyways, which starts this sort of trading of insults with the next day. Mr. Zelensky sort of in his own press conference says we know he's getting his information from Moscow. Actually, he lives, unfortunately, in a sphere of disinformation created by Moscow, which leads Mr. Trump, who's not known to take personal insults lightly. Mm-hmm. And we had, sort of starts openly calling Mr. Zelensky a dictator, which is, again, could have been written for him by the Kremlin.
Can I just ask about that? The idea of Zelensky being a dictator, where would that come from? You say it come from the Kremlin, but I guess how does he arrive at that?
It's been something that Putin has said a few times before now. He said, well, I can't make peace with Ukraine because, well, look, their president's not legitimate. There's two things that are remarkable about Mr. Trump taking up that line. The first is that he's basically repeating Putin's lines about Ukraine, which are based, again, on the fact that Ukraine hasn't had an election in the last year because martial law, because of the invasion. And then the second part is it's the other party in this conversation. Mr. Trump has no problems dealing with Vladimir Putin, who hasn't had a competitive election in 20 years. So for that to be suddenly an insult used against Mr. Zelensky, we're in the upside down.
Yeah. And the other point you mentioned there, Mark, was that Trump was saying that Zelensky has 4% approval rating. Can we just kind of quickly fact check that? Do we know, is that an accurate number?
No, it's not an accurate number. There was handily a poll that was released on Wednesday, the day that Mr. Trump said this, by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which found that 57% of Ukrainians trusted Mr. Zelensky. Now, that's down from the lofty heights he had at the start of the war when he had 90% support or what have you, but it's also up 5 points since he started arguing with Mr. Trump. Mr. Zelensky's popularity is not an issue or shouldn't be an issue in these talks. He is, even the opposition in Ukraine, and there is an opposition in Ukraine, concedes that at this moment they don't want elections and that he has the right to lead.
Mark, what does it signal that we're seeing this kind of public spat between Zelensky and Trump? Like, it seemed to be before Zelensky was maybe a little bit more careful around the statements that he was making towards the U.S. administration. But the fact that we are seeing this get kind of ugly in the public sphere, what does that tell you?
Yeah, I was in Kyiv both on the U.S. election day and on the day of Mr. Trump's inauguration. And there was a divide in the mood. The Ukrainian public was worried. There was a growing concern that basically what's happening right now would happen. They'd be forced into a peace negotiation with an American president who didn't have Ukraine's best interests at heart. On the other hand, the official line from Bankova, which is sort of where the Ukrainian president's office is, was very much that, we know how to work with Mr. Trump. He's a tough leader, and he will, he'll understand that showing American toughness means standing up to Putin. So they thought they had a way of dealing with Trump, of getting him over to their side. And they invested a lot of energy in having Mr. Zelensky talk to Fox News, talk to right-wing media, trying to get into that information sphere that they perceive Mr. Trump as living in. Apparently, it hasn't succeeded, and while being ignored, they feel their last resort probably is to make their concerns public. That unfortunately seems to have just aggravated Mr. Trump.
We'll be right back. So, Mark, besides the U.S., the European Union has been one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine in this war. And now the EU has essentially been left out of these talks between the U.S. and Russia that were happening earlier this week. So how is all of this playing out in Europe?
I think the European policymaking elite is deeply worried by what's happening. European defense theory, like Canada's defense theory, has been based around having a benign and friendly force in the White House and therefore the American military umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella. And suddenly, you have an aggressive Russia on one side, and you have a friend who's turned its back, seemingly not just on Ukraine, but, based on the statements that Vice President Vance made at the Munich Security Conference, where he attacked European leaders.
But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
they have to wonder if this is any friend at all. And one of the things you've seen a lot of here in London, where I live, in the British press, has been sort of historic comparisons. Is this 1938 Munich, where the Allies agreed to let Hitler have parts of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a peace that proved very temporary? Is this another Molotov-Ribbentrop pact between the Nazis and the Soviets, where they divided up Poland? Or is this, the Yalta Conference that we're staring at in 1945, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill divided up the world into spheres of influence?
So these are all examples you're citing that basically countries are deciding the fate of another country without them at the table then.
Exactly. And these are all examples where, at least in the examples of Munich and in Yalta, the Europeans were at least at the table. They were, or the British and the French were at the table deciding the fates of smaller countries. Now they're in the position of smaller countries looking around and just wondering what's being discussed in these little rooms between Trump and Putin, and wondering where this leads. And, there's a lot of talk in Europe now about what if we have to defend ourselves? What if, how can we build a European army, which has been an idea that's been around for a long time but never taken seriously because, there is NATO. But does NATO work if there's no American backstop to it?
This is, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the U.S., Canada, lots of European countries, all part of this organization. What does this situation mean for the future of NATO? Because I guess I wonder if it could signal the U.S. potentially pulling out of this organization, and where does that leave everyone else?
Yeah, this whole debate in a way revolves around NATO. If you think back to how this war started 3 years ago, the real sort of point that sort of was almost the main casus belli for Mr. Putin was the growing integration of Ukraine into NATO, and the promise, unfulfilled, that Ukraine and Georgia as well would eventually be allowed to join NATO. That was made at a conference in 2008. And when Ukraine talks about how this war can end, territorial concessions are really, really difficult, but even more difficult is to make those concessions if they don't have a promise of protection for the next time, so NATO membership. So a lot of this is about NATO. And if the United States, which is, Mr. Trump has been a critic of NATO since his first term in office, if it starts to withdraw from NATO, if it starts to pull away from NATO, even if it starts to question whether it would uphold NATO's basic tenets, which we've seen Mr. Trump do in the past, whether the United States would come to the aid of a country like, for instance, Latvia, where Canadian troops are stationed, that undermines the whole idea of NATO. Because, for instance, in Latvia, there is a Canadian-led battalion that is there not because this small force of several hundred troops can stop the Russian army, but because it's called a tripwire battalion. Its presence there is meant to indicate to the Russians that attacking Latvia means attacking all of NATO. Now, that means attacking the United States, or it used to mean.
And this is significant, of course, because of Article 5 of NATO. If one country is attacked, the rest are supposed to come to its aid, right?
Exactly. And to reinforce the seriousness of that, there are these deployments like the Canadian-led force in Latvia. So suddenly, if there is not the U.S. backstop to that Article 5, to that guarantee, those are just 800 troops in a very precarious position. If there is a possibility that, as many people in Eastern Europe certainly believe, that Mr. Putin's aims don't end with Ukraine, but it's about restoring the borders of the old Soviet Union, which includes the 3 Baltic states, for instance.
So if Trump does pull support from Ukraine, how big of an impact would it actually have?
In the short term, it would, Ukraine is in a decent position because Joe Biden, one of his last acts in office was to authorize a fresh tranche of military aid that Ukrainian military analysts tell me allows them to fight on for 6 months or even a year. That's at current sort of battlefield conditions where they're losing ground, but losing ground slowly. After that, I think Ukraine would face a very serious crisis, both in terms of air defense missiles, in terms of artillery, in terms of new weapons systems. They've already got an infantry crisis. And Russia's allies, North Korea, China, Iran, have not been backing away. They're supplying Russia with whatever it needs. And so that gap will grow larger, and it'll be harder and harder to envision Ukraine keeping the Russian invasion at bay.
Mark, of course, this Monday is the 3rd anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. What is the status of the war now as it currently stands?
I was just in Ukraine last month and visited a couple of parts of the front line. The status is that it's a very difficult moment for Ukraine, even without all this political undermining that's happening. From all along this 1,000-kilometer front line, Russia is very slowly but almost unstoppably moving forwards. It's not gone nearly at the pace that some people predicted it would. And if you think back to 3 years ago, This is a massive gain for Ukraine in that most people expected that Russia would conquer the entire country within days or weeks. And here we are 3 years later, and we're still talking about fighting around places called Pokrovsk and places called Kupiansk. But it's Russia going forwards, Ukraine going backwards, and that's with American support. If that American support goes, the situation gets very grim.
So, I mean, given that difficult situation then that Ukraine is currently in, I guess I wonder, from the people you've talked to, Mark, does it seem like Ukraine and Ukrainians would be open to a peace deal that is brokered by the U.S.?
If it's a peace deal brokered by the U.S., that's one thing. That's not what's happening right now. I think that has to be said as clearly as possibly. This is not a peace deal. If you don't have one of the warring parties at the table, this is some other arrangement being drawn up by outside powers. And everybody I've spoken to in Ukraine since this process started has come back with the answer. At the start of this war, we were alone, and everybody thought we'd be conquered in 3 days or 3 weeks. And if we have to keep on fighting, we'll keep on fighting. If we have to be a partisan force after, Russia takes more land, then we'll be a partisan force. We're not going to give up our land to this aggressor. And this, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict goes back centuries. It's not something that started 3 years ago out of the blue. And it's seen as existential for Ukraine and for Ukrainians. Mr. Zelensky, even if he agreed to some deal because he thought he had to, that doesn't mean the Ukrainian people will accept it. Too many people have died. Too many cities have been destroyed for Ukrainians to go, oh, well, that didn't go our way, and to just accept something that's foisted upon them. If it is a genuine peace process where Ukraine is consulted and the deal is put to a referendum and there's allowances made for people living in Russian occupied areas to come home, there's so many nuances that need to be discussed. And so far, none of those are being touched in this conversation between Russia and the U.S., between Trump and Putin.
Mark, always so great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. Today's episode had production assistance from Tiff Lamb. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Matt Frainer is our managing editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.